In the summer of 1586, completely oblivious, Mary would deliver Walsingham the only thing he needed to get rid of her for good. A single sentence written in Mary's own hand, which read, "Let the great plot commence." Hi everybody, it's Margot here, and today on Crowning Kingdom, I'm taking you to Fotheringay Castle to tell you the story of the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. After 19 years in captivity, Mary was brought here in September of 1586 to face trial for plotting to assassinate Queen Elizabeth I. After being found nearly unanimously guilty, she languished at the castle for months until February 8th, 1587, when she was brought to the castle's great hall and led up the steps of a purpose-built scaffold to meet her fate. Mary's story would continue, however, with a bizarre late-night funeral procession and burial in Peterborough Cathedral. And later, she was disinterred and reburied during the reign of her son, King James. Then later still, in the 19th century, the reopening of her tomb revealed some shocking royal family secrets that had long been lost to time. So come with me on a journey through the centuries as I tell you the story of the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe to help me keep my channel growing. Born on the 8th of December, 1542, Mary Stuart, more commonly known now as Mary, Queen of Scots, is one of history's best-known figures, although also perhaps one of the most divisive. Viewed as either a papist plotter or a Catholic martyr, her tragic story has spawned the creation of art, theatre, poetry, and literature throughout the centuries. Mary became the Queen of Scotland at just 6 days old and was crowned 9 months later, and it wasn't long after that the search for her future husband began. Firstly, there was an attempted contract of marriage between Mary and her cousin Prince Edward, future King Edward VI, but it fell apart and was followed shortly thereafter by a betrothal to the Dauphin of France, Francis. In preparation for her future, Mary was sent to live at the French court just a few months before her 6th birthday. She would be Queen of France by the age of 16, and a widow already shortly before her 18th birthday. She returned to Scotland, but seemed a stranger in her homeland, a devout Catholic in a realm of religious unrest and powerful Protestants who had spent the majority of her life in a foreign country. She was immediately given the side-eye by the Scottish peers and much of the public, and their feelings of suspicion would remain for years. Mary's return to the British Isles also saw her step onto the chessboard of English politics and positioned her directly opposite her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England. Many Catholics in Scotland, England, and throughout Europe had long rejected Henry VIII's divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Their refusal to acknowledge their legal separation meant viewing Henry's marriage to his second wife, Anne Boleyn, as invalid, which rendered their daughter, Queen Elizabeth, illegitimate. Having descended from Henry VIII's eldest sister Margaret, Queen of Scotland, Mary was one of the senior surviving legitimate descendants from the founder of the Tudor dynasty, Henry VII. This meant that many, both at home and abroad, believed it was she, and not the current occupant, Elizabeth, who was the rightful Queen of England. To add further strength to her claim, the childless Elizabeth had no nominated heir to the throne, so even those who believed in Elizabeth's birthright to rule also viewed Mary as her heir presumptive. It was even said that Mary had been heard to boast that she was the, quote, nearest kinswoman to her cousin, the Virgin Queen. To try to maintain some control over the situation, Elizabeth attempted to wed Mary to her personal favorite courtier and rumored lover, Robert Dudley, with the idea that the three of them could all live together in England in some kind of bizarre menage a trois. For her agreement to this arrangement, Mary would then be officially named as Elizabeth's heir. This union, however, was never made, largely because Elizabeth hadn't bothered to consult either the bride nor her intended groom before announcing her plan. Neither were keen, and, to be fair to Mary, I wouldn't particularly want to marry my cousin's cast-offs and take part in a weird sister-wife situation either. Instead, Mary married her English-born half-cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, also a grandchild of Queen Margaret, but descending from her second marriage with Archibald Douglas. Some allege that this union was itself a love triangle, or love square, if you will, with both Mary and her husband often found, individually, in the company or even in the bed of the same man, David Rizzio. Darnley would ultimately murder Rizzio right in front of his pregnant wife, but that's a story for another day. Queen Elizabeth was enraged by the marriage, arguing that as an English subject and her cousin, Darnley should not have entered into marriage without her approval. She would have also been aware that any children the couple produced would have an even stronger claim to the English throne, with royal English blood on both sides. Protestants in Scotland also opposed the Queen's marriage to another Catholic. Mary and Darnley's marriage was not a happy one, with Darnley forever resentful of his being king consort rather than ruler in his own right. They lived together long enough for Mary to become pregnant, but their relationship could not recover from the murder of David Rizzio. 9 months after the birth of their son, Darnley was invited to return to Edinburgh by his wife, where he recovered from an illness at a friend's house. In the early hours of the 10th of February, 1567, the house Darnley was staying in exploded. His body was found nearby, showing no traces of visible injury. He had been smothered, and his body placed near the wreckage along with a cloak, a chair, and a dagger. It was widely acknowledged that a Scottish courtier, James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, was the man responsible for the killing itself, but Mary's involvement in the murder of her husband has been a topic of debate for literal centuries, and was indeed the most pressing of matters at the 16th century Scottish court. Elizabeth even wrote to Mary, describing the rumors she had heard, but promising her cousin she didn't believe any of them, of course. Perhaps Mary's story would have ended vastly differently had she not, 2 months after Darnley died, subsequently married the primary suspect in his murder. However, the truth of it is that she may not have entered into the union willingly. Her third husband, Lord Bothwell, is one of history's more disgusting figures. Lord High Admiral of Scotland, Bothwell was married 3 times over, and, somewhat unusually for the time, all 3 of his wives were alive at the same time, owing to his unfortunate habit of abandoning them at the drop of a hat. His first marriage, unrecognized by the British courts, was to a Norwegian noblewoman, Anna, who was forced by Bothwell to sell all of her possessions to pay his debts. The treatment she received by Bothwell was so poor that she launched a legal suit against him in 1567. She was cast aside by her husband, without much disappointment, I would imagine, and spent the rest of her life in Norway. His second wife was Lady Jean Gordon, who appealed for an annulment to her marriage based on the grounds of Bothwell's unrestrained adultery, or what we would describe today as sexual assault, involving members of the couple's staff. The annulment was granted although Bothwell had long since left his wife behind in favor of one of the guests who had attended his wedding to Jean just a year before, Mary, Queen of Scots. Whether she entered the marriage of her own free will is unclear. Records show she was abducted by Bothwell and his men and taken to his castle in Dunbar, in theory for her safety, with many of the Scottish peers actively deriding her in public in relation to the murder of her husband. Whether she went with him willingly or not is the question most often pondered, but eyewitness accounts tell us that however she ended up at Dunbar Castle, she was raped by Bothwell as soon as she arrived. It is theorized by some that Bothwell's aim was to impregnate Mary and force her into marriage. Whether or not that was his intended aim, 2 weeks after her abduction, the couple returned to Edinburgh, and 1 week later, they were married. This was the last straw for both the public and the Scottish peers, all of whom immediately turned on the Queen. The Scots noblemen raised an army whose forces faced those of Mary and Bothwell on the 15th of June, 1567. But Mary's forces dwindled before battle could even commence. Bothwell was driven into imprisoned exile in Denmark, where he would get exactly what he deserved, dying, alone and insane, chained to a pillar in the dungeon of Dragsholm Castle in 1578. As for Mary, she was imprisoned in Lochleven Castle, where, on July of 1567, she suffered the trauma of miscarrying twins, and, on the following day, was forced to abdicate in favor of her 1-year-old son, King James VI. She had last set eyes upon her son in April, and would have had no way of knowing that she would never set eyes upon him again. Almost a year after her imprisonment, Mary managed to escape her confinement, aided by the brother of the castle's owner. She also managed to raise an army of 6,000 men, and even managed to face opposing forces on the field at the Battle of Langside on the 13th of May, 1568. Mary did not, however, manage to win, and, in a move I suspect she came to regret, she fled to England, seeking the protection and assistance of her cousin, Elizabeth. Mary was initially taken into protective custody at Carlisle Castle, and was moved further south to Bolton Castle, while Elizabeth ordered an inquest into Mary's involvement in Darnley's murder. Inquiry commissions were set up at Hampton Court Palace in London and the King's Manor in York. Although invited to the latter, Mary refused to attend, as she did not acknowledge the power of any court to try her. The main topic of debate were the so-called casket letters, 8 letters and a handful of sonnets said to have been written by Mary and sent to the Earl of Bothwell. The contents of the letters would have confirmed Mary's involvement in Darnley's murder, were they indeed written by her, but their true author has never been firmly identified, and Mary was neither acquitted or convicted, but remained in the custody of the English Queen for the next 19 years. Throughout nearly 2 decades of confinement, Mary was moved from house to castle and back again, spending time in Pontefract Castle, Wingfield Manor, Tutbury Castle, Buxton Old Hall, Chatsworth House, Sheffield Manor and Castle, Tixall Hall, and Chartley Castle. With her were always no fewer than 16 members of staff, the 30 carts it took to transport all of her belongings, and a number of spies, reporting her every move and word back to the English court. All the locations where Mary was kept are to be found roughly halfway between London and Scotland, and a fair distance away from the sea, and not without reason. By very dint of the blood in her veins, Mary was still viewed by many as the heir to the English throne. Among those who thought as much were the King of Spain, Philip II, former brother-in-law to Queen Elizabeth, having been married to her sister Mary for 4 years, as well as King Henri III of France, former brother-in-law of Mary Queen of Scots, who was once married to Henri's brother, and the Pope himself, who was actively calling for Elizabeth's assassination in the name of the true faith. Elizabeth and her counselors lived in fear that an armed invasion launched with the purpose of installing Mary onto the English throne could take place at any time. But there were threats closer to home as well. The rising of the North in 1569, a Catholic rebellion with the aim of deposing Elizabeth in favor of Mary, failed, and was followed shortly thereafter by the Ridolfi plot in 1571 and the Throckmorton plot of 1583, both with the same aim and the same failure. Mary would spend years sending letters asking for assistance to Catholic sympathizers in Europe, not realizing that many of the staff she entrusted to send her missives were in fact spies working for Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster and Secretary of State. For those who have seen Game of Thrones, Walsingham was the Lord Varys of the Elizabethan court, whose little sparrows, or personal spies, numbered well over 50, and were spread throughout the courts and villages of Europe and the Mediterranean. It was believed by many English peers that no discussion of England or Scotland could be had on the continent without Walsingham finding out about it. And it would be Walsingham, acting with near hysterical Protestant zeal, who would lay the trap that would eventually seal Mary's fate. For years, Elizabeth had been under pressure by her own government and advisers to get rid of Mary. Elizabeth knew that Mary's existence brought her danger, which is why she continued to keep her cousin in captivity rather than returning her to Scotland or even back to France, as the former queen had begged her to do. But Elizabeth was worried that the killing of an anointed queen could set a dangerous precedent, or that she could face potential retaliation from Mary's son, King James, were he to form a Catholic alliance with Europe. In 1583, Walsingham passed the Act for the Queen's Safety, a law which sanctioned the killing of anyone who plotted against Elizabeth. A year later, Mary attempted to negotiate her release by offering to remain in England, renounce the Pope, forego her claims on the English crown, acknowledge Protestant rule in Scotland, and let Elizabeth help choose a wife for her son James, all in exchange for alleviating the restraints of her current captivity. To Mary's great surprise, her son himself rejected this plan, signing an alliance with Elizabeth and officially abandoning his mother. Now knowing James would not pose a threat, Walsingham was ready to settle the issue of Mary for good. He wrote to Robert Dudley, quote, "So long as that devilish woman lives, neither her majesty must make account to continue in quiet possession of her crown, nor her faithful servants assure themselves of safety of their lives." In modern terms, Walsingham was telling Dudley that, as long as Mary was alive, Elizabeth would never sit securely on the throne in peace, and, with more of a personal concern that would certainly motivate me had I been in his position, her staff were at risk of assassination should an attempted coup take place. All Walsingham had to do was catch Mary plotting to overthrow Elizabeth, and use the law behind his own act for the Queen's safety to take her off the political chessboard for good. By 1586, Walsingham not only had dozens of spies on the continent, but he had successfully infiltrated Mary's inner circle, including Catholic double agents. Mary began corresponding with contacts at the French court, who, unbeknownst to her, had begun working for Walsingham. She was led to believe her correspondence was secure, and she was sending coded messages in watertight boxes hidden inside beer barrels produced by a local sympathetic brewer to France, not realizing that Walsingham had the brewer in his pocket, originated the idea of the casks, held the cipher to decode Mary's messages, and was reading each and every one. At this time, a number of Catholic conspirators were attempting to engage yet another plot to assassinate Elizabeth and replace her with Mary. What is it they say about doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting different results? Walsingham had access to nearly all of their correspondence, yet, instead of blowing the whistle, he watched and waited, hoping Mary would eventually incriminate herself by making note of her approval of the plan in one of her own letters of correspondence. In the summer of 1586, completely oblivious, Mary would deliver Walsingham the only thing he needed to get rid of her for good. A single sentence written in Mary's own hand, which read, "Let the great plot commence." On the 11th of August, Mary was arrested while out riding and taken here to Fotheringay Castle, where she was put into the custody of Sir Amias Paulet, an English diplomat. So concerned were the English nobles with the risk of Mary's escape that the castle was guarded by no fewer than 70 foot soldiers and 50 bowmen. The only piece of the castle that survives here is this chunk of masonry from the castle's keep. The gate built around it includes thistles, nods to Mary's Scottish heritage, and 3 plaques now hang on its irons. One tells us that the castle used to stand here. The other tells us that it was here that King Richard III was born, more on his demise to come, and one placed in memorial of Mary, Queen of Scots, by the Stuart History Society, placed here in 1964. In October, Mary was put on trial here under the Act for the Queen's Safety, accused of treason for plotting to kill Queen Elizabeth. Mary faced her trial before a court of 36 noblemen in the great chamber at Fotheringay, where she was forced to sit in a subordinate position next to an empty throne which represented the English Queen. Mary, naturally, denied the charges. She correctly surmised that, quote, "all of this is the work of Monsieur de Walsingham for my destruction," and she confessed that she had, of course, quote, "having been detained and imprisoned, earnestly wished for liberty." She also claimed that the plot was never hers to begin with, stating, quote, "Can I be responsible for the cranial projects of a few desperate men?" which I'm pretty sure is what I asked the lawyer during my divorce proceedings. And finally, using the kind of legal loophole that I love, Mary pointed out that as a foreign anointed queen who had never been an English subject to begin with, she could not, therefore, be convicted of treason against crown and country. Had she been found innocent, the video would end right here. However, on the 25th of October, 1586, Mary was found guilty, with only one of the 36 councillors, the fantastically named Edward Lazouche, expressing dissent against the verdict. And, as Walsingham had ensured from the creation of his law written for this express purpose, her sentence was death. But Walsingham had forgotten one seemingly small but rather important detail. Mary's warrant of execution was useless without the signature of Queen Elizabeth, and, still worried about potential repercussions from Europe or setting a precedent for the future, Elizabeth was reluctant to give the official order. While waiting for Elizabeth to act, Mary would languish in Fotheringay for the next 10 weeks. no longer with the trappings of her queenship, but stripped of most of her staff and her belongings. She was kept as a convicted criminal. Walsingham and Elizabeth's council put as much pressure on their queen as possible. At one point, Elizabeth thought she had come up with a solution. She mused out loud that if a loyal subject were to simply murder Mary, then Elizabeth wouldn't face the wrath of Scotland, or, more importantly, France. Mary's jailer, Miah's Paulet, was asked if he would be willing to carry out the deed. He abjectly refused, saying he would not, quote, leave so great a blot to my poor posterity as shed blood without law or warrant, essentially telling the Queen he wouldn't go down in history as an assassin by murdering Mary in cold blood, however nicely Elizabeth asked. Elizabeth was angry with him and his, as she put it, daintiness. Walsingham and another of Elizabeth's statesmen, William Cecil, finally came up with a solution. On the 1st of February, when Elizabeth sat at her desk to sign a number of important documents, a junior secretary of state slipped the warrant for Mary's arrest into the pile of papers at the English Queen's desk. When Elizabeth had finished signing all the documents, she asked a junior secretary, William Davison, to hold on to them for the time being, the implication being that, of course, she knew what she had signed. However, her counselors would wait no longer. Davison passed the warrant to Cecil, who immediately summoned 10 members of the Privy Council without the Queen's acknowledgement. The council unanimously decided to carry out the sentence at once. A rider was dispatched to Fotheringay with the news, and the countdown to Mary's execution began. After living in a suspended state of limbo for months, Mary, Queen of Scots, was informed on the 7th of February that she was to die the next morning. After spending nearly 2 decades as a prisoner, and the last 10 weeks literally waiting for an axe to fall, she received this news with an understandable amount of gratitude, saying, quote, I thank you for such welcome news. You will do me great good in withdrawing from the world that of which I am very glad to go. Denied a final meeting with her chaplain, she spent the evening organizing her affairs, making lists of her meager belongings and to whom they should go, organizing the dispersion of her money amongst her loyal ladies' maids, one of whom, Jane, had spent nearly 20 years in captivity with her, as well as her escape at Loch Leven, and writing her last letter. It was addressed to the King of France, Henri III, to tell him of what was about to happen to her, and to say goodbye. In it, she maintained she was being executed for her faith and her position in the English succession, and nothing more. She told him that she would face the executioner, quote, innocent of any crime. I feel the need to point out here that the Pope had specifically told Catholics that killing the heretical Queen Elizabeth was actually sanctioned by God, so were Mary, in theory, to be involved in Elizabeth's assassination, she would not have considered it a sin, nor, in fact, a crime. Which, yeah, okay. It was reported that on her last night here, Mary did lay in bed, but did not sleep, instead asking her ladies to read her a story, which they did over the sounds of the saws and hammers erecting the scaffold downstairs, echoing up through the castle walls from the great hall. She was summoned from her chamber at some point between 8 and 9 in the morning, and taken to the hall, which sat directly underneath the great chamber where she had been tried. Her groom, Hannibal Stewart, bore the crucifix before her as she processed to the hall. Eyewitnesses report she showed no sign of fear or distress as she came down. However, when she stepped foot into the great hall, she was informed that she was not permitted to bring her remaining servants into the hall, for it was intended that she would, quote, die alone. The pathetic reasoning given was that her 2 lady-maids might cry out and upset both Mary as well as those who had come to witness the scene. Although Mary was supposed to die alone, I want to point out that there were around 300 spectators gathered in the hall already, a mix of local dignitaries, members of Elizabeth's council, and ordinary local people given the privilege of witnessing the execution of a queen. Mary argued back, however, reiterating that she descended from King Henry VII, was a crowned Queen of France, and an anointed Queen of Scotland, and she knew that other executed noblewomen had been permitted to bring their maids to the scaffold, and she expected to do the same. She also swore that her maids would not cause a scene. And here I want to mention 2 things. 1. I am referring to Jane Kennedy and Elizabeth Curll as Mary's maids, but they were much more than that, being her closest source of companionship, company, and loyal friendship for years. And 2, I am surprised that her argument actually worked. She was permitted to bring 6 of her household staff into the hall to be with her at the very end. The scaffold that had been erected in the hall here was raised about 2 feet off the ground and measured about 12 feet square. It was draped in black fabric and near the blazing fire, lit to attempt to keep the hall warm in the February chill. There were 3 stools on the platform, 2 for Elizabeth's witnesses, the Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent, and 1 for Mary to use while she disrobed. The axe, described as, quote, like those with which they cut wood, was already on the scaffold, which was surrounded by a rank of soldiers. The executioner, known as Bull, was nearby, having been paid £10, which would be about £2,500 today, for his service. Personally, I wouldn't cut off anybody's head for less than 10 grand, but that's just me. Mary entered the hall dressed in black velvet, detailed with jet and pearl buttons, and a red kirtle underneath, the Catholic color of martyrdom. She also wore a white veil which trailed down her back, and 2 rosaries hanging from her waist, one of which would be passed down through generations of the Arundel family before being stolen in 2021. She carried both a crucifix and a prayer book with her as she entered. Before being led up the 3 steps to the scaffold stage, Mary gave a small gift to Sir William Fitzwilliam, Castellan of Fotheringay, who had been kind to Mary during her imprisonment. She then bid farewell to 4 of her staff, giving small gifts to them as well, all while maintaining what was described as, quote, smiling cheer. She then mounted the steps to the scaffold with Jane Kennedy and Elizabeth Curll behind her. She was then expected to sit and listen to the charges being read against her. William Cecil's nephew, tasked with recording the events, described the scene as thus, quote, during the reading of which commission for her execution was read, the Queen of Scots was silent, listening unto it, as if it had been a pardon from her Majesty for her life, or as if she had been ignorant of the English language. Her blank expression never wavered as her charges were read out. She did react, however, when the Protestant Dean of Peterborough, Richard Fletcher, tried to harass her into converting from the Catholic faith, to which she informed him, most impressively, in my opinion, that she was firm in her faith and intended to spill her blood in defense of it. Jane and Elizabeth helped her to disrobe, and Mary even smiled and joked that she had never taken her clothes off in the presence of so many people before. Now, in her red petticoat and satin bodice, she was approached by the executioner, who, in a centuries-old tradition, asked his intended victim for her forgiveness. Mary nailed her response again by saying, quote, "I forgive you with all my heart, for now I hope you shall make an end of all my troubles." At this point, Jane and Elizabeth were crying in lamentation, and Mary had to gently scold them both, reminding them that she had promised they would be quiet. Then Jane produced a white cloth embroidered with gold, which had been chosen by Mary for its express purpose. Jane kissed the fabric and draped it over Mary's eyes and the top of her head, fashioning it a bit like a turban and leaving the back of her neck exposed. With that, Mary knelt onto a small cushion in front of her. She then prayed out loud for the English Catholic Church, for her son, and for Queen Elizabeth. Unable to see, she groped for the block with her hands, and upon finding it, put her chin into place. She stretched out her arms and said in Latin, "Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum." The executioner's assistant put one hand on Mary to steady her, and then the axe fell, but did not reach its intended target. The first blow cut into the back of her head, mercifully likely rendering her unconscious, although, horrifically, there was a witness report that she uttered the words, "Sweet Jesus," after the first botched attempt. However, Bull was quick and accurate with his second blow, which nearly completely severed her neck, aside from a small piece of sinew, which was cut through by using the axe blade as a saw. As is tradition, the executioner lifted Mary's head by the red of her hair and shouted, "God save the Queen." However, unbeknownst to him or the majority of the crowd, Mary had been wearing a wig, which then came loose. Her severed head thudded to the ground, revealing her natural hair had been close-cropped and gray. Cecil's nephew said at this point she looked nothing like the Mary they had all just seen minutes before. Disturbingly, he also reported that her lips continued to move for the following 15 minutes. Upon the crash of Mary's head to the wooden boards of the scaffold, the room full of shocked spectators fell silent, and the Dean of Peterborough, showing he was truly a man with a knack for timing, took this moment to stand over her body and shout, quote, "So perish all the Queen's enemies." And the indignity did not stop there. As the executioner came to move Mary's corpse, he discovered that Mary's small Skye terrier had hidden in his mistress's skirts, unbeknownst to the crowd. He cowered, shaking within her clothing, and had to be forced out, where he quickly scurried up alongside her body before lying down in the pool of blood between Mary's head and shoulders. Eventually, he was picked up and carried away to be washed. As to his subsequent fate, I wish I could tell you. Everybody aside from the sheriff and his men were ordered out of the hall, but were not yet permitted to leave in order to control the spread of the news. Anything in the hall that had blood on it was immediately destroyed, including Mary's clothing, the scaffold itself, and the executioner's box. All of it was burned, lest any of the objects make their way out of the castle to become a symbol of martyrdom. Nothing could be left for Mary's supporters to rally around. All traces of the Queen were ordered to be destroyed. Mary's body was taken upstairs, where a surgeon was ready to embalm her. At around 4 p.m., her internal organs were removed and buried, secretly, somewhere in the grounds of the castle, their exact location never revealed to this day. Her corpse was then salted, unceremoniously wrapped in the woolen covering of a billiard table, covered in a wax winding sheet, and then sealed in a lead coffin, where it would stay until July. A single rider had been dispatched to London to deliver the news of Mary's death to Queen Elizabeth. He arrived at 9 a.m. the day after the execution. When Elizabeth received the message, she had a full-blown meltdown. It was reported that she put herself into mourning dress and, quote, gave herself over to grief. It was also commented that she shed more tears for Mary than she had for her father's or either of her siblings' deaths. Eventually, she managed to come out of her grief long enough to haul her entire council in for a heavy interrogation. She ranted and raved, insisting that she had given Davison explicit instructions not to hand off the warrant and that her counsel acted without her consent. He would be thrown into the Tower for his part in it all, but let out 19 months later when both Cecil and Walsingham interjected on his behalf. Walsingham himself managed to escape retribution, as he caught a conveniently timed illness in the weeks before Mary's execution, which meant he had returned home and could not be found at court. His miraculous recovery and return to the council only happened a few weeks after the deed was done, when the wind in Elizabeth's sails had been firmly removed by Cecil. Elizabeth had continued stubbornly to hold on to her plausible deniability until Cecil pointed out that her theatrics had no purpose outside of easing her conscience. He said the outside world would know she had signed the warrant and would hold her accountable regardless of what happened to it after the fact. He also mentioned that declaring Mary had been killed unlawfully could potentially give strength to her papist enemies, implying she didn't have control of her own council. That seemed to do the trick. The mood in the streets of England, however, was one of celebration. There were parties in the streets and the tolling of bells as news of the vanquishing of the Queen's enemy was proclaimed across the country. A mob went to the French ambassador's house, ostensibly to ask him to contribute some wood for the creation of a celebratory bonfire, but really to rub salt into the wound over the loss of his friend. When he indignantly refused and shut the door in their faces, the group decided to construct their bonfire directly outside of his house and held their party just outside his front door. In Scotland, there are wildly differing reports of James's response to his mother's execution. He has been described as being overwhelmingly distraught, being completely unbothered, and privately rejoicing and claiming, quote, "Now I am sole king." We all contain multitudes, of course, so perhaps it was a bit of all three. There was mild unrest within the Scottish court, and at first James refused to speak with Elizabeth's emissary, but by the start of March he began communicating with the English Queen again, and that seemed to be the end of the matter. In France, a requiem mass was held in Notre Dame, which had been draped in black fabric for the event. The country was ordered into a state of mourning, owing to the death of a crowned dowager queen. As word of Mary's courage and cheerfulness, as well as her willingness to die for her faith, spread throughout a Europe shocked at her execution, she became a celebrated and revered figure among the Catholic courts and proletariat, practically becoming canonized at the court of Spain. In fact, King Philip of Spain came to believe that the crown of England was, in fact, now his, claiming Mary had promised it to him before she died. This would eventually lead to the launching of his armada years down the line, and it was Philip who honored Mary's last wish by paying her servants' wages and settling all of her debts. And at Fotheringay Castle, Mary's servants still remained as prisoners, permitted to return neither to France nor to Scotland, as Mary had requested they be allowed to do before her death. They wouldn't see freedom until after Mary's funeral, held nearly 6 full months after her death. Mary's coffin had just been sitting in Fotheringay Castle as life moved on outside its walls. At one point, it was found to be leaking and had to be repaired by a plumber. And still it sat. I have to mention that Mary had specifically asked to be buried in France, but I'm sure it doesn't surprise you to hear that this request was firmly ignored. Originally, it was posited that she would be interred in a small local church, either buried in an unmarked grave or even put up onto a shelf. Elizabeth's advisors were worried that her remains would become a rallying point for Catholic conspirators. It was only when the shock waves of her death died down and the council felt there was no European retribution immediately incoming that real thought was given to Mary's burial and funeral. It was decided that she would be laid to rest at Peterborough Cathedral, 12 miles away. However, precautions were still taken to prevent public interjection, protest, or retribution. So, it was in the dead of night, on Sunday the 30th of July, that Mary's body was transported out of the castle under torchlight, not reaching Peterborough Cathedral until 2 o'clock in the morning. Her coffin was conveyed on a small carriage draped in black fabric with brack pennons, and each coffin-bearer was paid £1 for their duty. It is known that along with her coffin, an effigy of some sort, either a depiction of her person or symbols of her status, were also borne in the funeral procession, carried under a velvet canopy of black. The Garter King of Arms, heralds, and nobles all came up from London to take part in the procession. In addition, well over 100 poor women were invited to traipse behind the coffin. As part of her PR campaign, Queen Elizabeth had gifted them all brand new clothing, black mourning dresses, veils, and hoods. Around 10 of Mary's ladies were also part of the cortege, but conspicuously absent were any members of the Scottish court. On reaching the cathedral, Mary's coffin was taken to the side, where a grave had already been dug. The burial vault sat directly opposite that of Catherine of Aragon's, and the details of her burial and funeral will be included in an upcoming video. In fact, Mary's grave was dug by the same man who had worked on Catherine's gravesite decades before, Robert Scarlett. Quietly, at night, her coffin was interred without any ceremony, quote, without chanting or tolling or saying a word. Above the site were placed black draping and the royal arms of Scotland, as well as those of Mary's first 2 husbands, but Bothwell's remained noticeably absent, obviously. Note that the flags you see hanging today date from the 1920s, the originals having been torn down by Cromwell's army during the Civil War. They also took it upon themselves to destroy Catherine of Aragon's tomb while they were at it. It was hours later, in the daylight of the 1st of August, 1587, that the funeral ceremony actually took place. The Dean of Peterborough once again displayed his fantastic skill at public relations by commenting on how nice the weather was, and implying the good Lord had blessed them with such weather as a sign of a job well done, saying, quote, "The day being fair did, as it were, show favour from heaven, and commended the justice." Before the service began, most of those present who knew Mary on a personal level left, not wanting to attend a Protestant service. In addition to the Dean of Peterborough, the Bishop of Lincoln gave a sermon dedicated to Mary's life and death, despite the fact he had never actually met her, commenting, quote, "Let us give thanks for the happy dissolution of the high and mighty Princess Mary, late Queen of Scotland and Dowager of France, whose life and death, at this time, I have not much to say, because I was not acquainted with the one, neither was I present at the other. The broken rods of staff from Mary's officers were placed in the tomb to mark the end of the service. If you watched the coverage of the funeral of the late Queen Elizabeth II, you may have noticed this is a tradition that still carries on to this day, and was the singular acknowledgment of Mary's status that was afforded to her after her death. After this pathetic excuse for a send-off, all of the noblemen and women present were invited to a raging party at the bishop's house. It was said that Queen Elizabeth spent £321 on the entire funeral, and a third of that went toward the food and drink for the after-party. As for Mary's servants, once the funeral was over, they were finally set free. Shortly thereafter, a brave soul composed an epitaph that was placed above Mary's tomb, referring to her as a queen who had been killed by the, quote, barbarous cruelty and tyrannical sentence of the English. It further went to say that with the death of Mary went the death of Elizabeth's civility, and that the, quote, sacred ashes of the divine Mary violate the majesty of all kings and princes. It's unknown who wrote such a telling off, or exactly how long it remained above Mary's grave, but it was ripped down as soon as it was discovered, leaving instead a simple grave marker and nothing more. For the next 20 years, anyway. In 1603, King James sent a new black velvet pall down to Peterborough to hang above his mother's resting place. But nearly 10 years later, he decided to do one better. He sent a message to the Dean of Peterborough, saying he wished to bring Mary's remains down to London to her rightful resting place of Westminster Abbey. It's interesting to note that in his written letter, he refers to Queen Elizabeth, the woman whom almost all of Mary's followers regarded as her murderess, as his late dear sister. Charming. In 1612, Mary's remains were brought to Westminster Abbey and reinterred opposite the tomb that held said dear sister, as well as Queen Mary I of England. The tomb was designed and partially carved by Cornelius Cure and is made out of 2 types of alabaster. The figure's feet rest on the line of Scotland, and her hands are placed in eternal prayer. As for her likeness, it is thought that her face is based on a portrait of Mary that was long held in Hardwicke Hall, one of her many places of confinement throughout her life, and although there are at least 2 death masks reported to be those of Mary, Queen of Scots, the truth is their provenance cannot be accurately pinpointed, although I tend to think this one bears at least a passing resemblance to the Westminster Abbey effigy. What do you think? The actual reinterment of Mary's remains was carried out on the 11th of October, 1612, but again in the dead of night in order to avoid any crowds. But the story of Mary's tomb did not end there. In 1867, the Dean of Westminster Abbey was on a hunt for the remains of Mary's son, King James. You'd think there'd be an accurate record of where Britain's kings and queens have been laid to rest, but it might surprise you to find out just how often they seem to go missing. It was theorized that perhaps James had been buried with his mother. When Mary's tomb was opened, however, James was not there. He would later be discovered in the tomb of his great-grandparents, King Henry VII and his wife Elizabeth of York. What they did find in Mary's burial vault was quite surprising. Upon opening the tomb under Mary's effigy, a vast pile of lead coffins was discovered. Some of these were small enough to be recognized as the coffins of children and babies. There were also a number of urns of varying shapes and sizes scattered throughout. Eventually, all whose remains were located inside were largely identified. There was Mary's grandson, Henry, Prince of Wales, who died before he came to the throne, the crown passing to his brother, Charles I, instead, and keep an eye out for an upcoming video about him. Her granddaughter, Elizabeth of Bohemia, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, and 10 of her great-great-grandchildren, all sired by King James II. Also within the tomb were the sad progeny of Mary's great-great-granddaughter, Queen Anne, who had 17 pregnancies. Of those, only 5 were live births, and the only child of hers to live beyond the age of 2 was her son, Prince William of Gloucester, who died at the age of 11. Nearly all of these great-great-great-grandchildren of Mary, Queen of Scots, had been laid to rest inside her tomb. It was noted that Mary's lead coffin was still intact, and it was not opened. Instead, the contents of the vault were rearranged and closed back inside of it, hopefully to rest forevermore. Here at the site of the once great Fotheringay Castle, there is almost little left that would imply anything of great note ever took place here. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the castle was sold off by King James, although it was already described as ruinous by 1635. As tends to be the case with once great structures, as soon as the castle was abandoned, the local townsfolk could help themselves to any of the remaining pieces, using them to construct or repair their own homes or businesses. A nearby inn, the Talbot Hotel in Owendal, claims that the staircase in their B&B was salvaged from Fotheringay Castle, and might be the very staircase that Mary used as she processed from her chamber to the great hall on the morning of her execution. But it also might not. It is strange to stand here and imagine what transpired at the site over 400 years ago. These thistles, sometimes referred to as Queen Mary's tears, blanket the earth, and are a poignant reminder of the events that took place here in the centuries before, and are, I think, a delicate and touching tribute to a life hard-lived, hard-fought, and so brutally ended. But perhaps Mary's greatest lasting legacy is not these thistles, or that chunk of stone, or even her tomb in Westminster Abbey, but rather the fact that every monarch who has sat on the British throne since King James I was crowned King of England in 1603, thus uniting the crowns of England and Scotland, has descended directly from the ill-fated Mary, Queen of Scots. So, although Mary herself never sat upon the throne that she, and so many others, believed was rightfully hers, it is, in the end, the blood that was spilled here at Fotheringay Castle that still runs through the veins of those who wear the British crown today. This has been Crown and Kingdom. Thank you to Mary, Queen of Scots, for living a life worth talking about, to Jane Kennedy and Elizabeth Curl for being her ride or die, literally, besties, and to you for watching. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe to help me keep my channel growing. This is Margot Moore saying goodbye and good time.